The first time my father brought her into our house, he didn't even bother to look ashamed. He just stood there with his hand resting casually on the small of her back, like he had every right in the world, like my mother hadn't died less than 4 months earlier, like the hospice bed hadn't still been in the garage because I couldn't bring myself to sell it yet, like I hadn't been the one holding mom's hand when her breathing turned ragged, and the nurse told me gently that this was the end. And I remember standing there, frozen in the doorway, while he smiled too wide and said, "Sweetheart, I want you to meet someone important to me," as if the word sweetheart hadn't turned sour in his mouth years ago, as if he hadn't already done enough damage, as if this wasn't the same woman who used to sit at our kitchen table drinking coffee with my mother during chemo weeks, nodding sympathetically, offering to drive her to appointments, holding her hand and saying things like, "You're so strong, Laura," while apparently sleeping with my father behind her back. And I swear to God, the room felt like it tilted when I realized who she was, when I saw the familiar curve of her smile, the same laugh I'd heard echoing through our living room during game nights, the same woman who had hugged me at my mother's funeral and whispered, "I'm here for you if you need anything." Because now she was standing there wearing my mother's old sweater, the green one with the loose sleeve that mom loved because it didn't press against her chemo port. And it felt like the air had been knocked out of me all over again, like grief had found a new way to cut deeper. Because it wasn't just that he'd moved on quickly, it was that he'd moved on with her, with the woman who had been woven into the fabric of our family while my mother was dying. And the worst part, the part that still makes my stomach turn when I replay it, was how normal he tried to make it seem. How he said, "We didn't plan for things to happen like this, and you're old enough to understand that life is complicated," as if I were the one being unreasonable for standing there in silence, while every memory I had of my parents, of loyalty, of trust, of what marriage was supposed to mean, shattered into something unrecognizable. And I remember thinking in that moment that I wasn't just meeting my father's girlfriend, I was meeting the living proof that while my mother had been fighting for her life, while she'd been losing weight and hair and dignity in ways she never deserved, while she'd whispered in the middle of the night that she was scared to leave me alone with him because she didn't know if he'd be okay, he'd already chosen someone else. And I realized with a kind of sick clarity that this wasn't a new relationship blooming out of shared grief like he would later claim. This was something that had roots, deep ones, tangled ones, something that had been growing while my mother was still alive, still hopeful, still trusting. And I could feel my hands shaking, but my voice stayed calm when I finally spoke, when I finally looked at him and said, "You cheated on mom with her friend while she was dying." Because I needed him to hear the words out loud, not softened, not dressed up, not hidden behind euphemisms. And the way his face flickered, just for a split second, told me everything I needed to know before he tried to deny it, before he launched into the same tired excuses people like him always use, the ones about loneliness and emotional distance and how things just happened. And I remember thinking that the audacity of standing there in our house with her hand still on his back, introducing her to me like this was some milestone moment, like I should be grateful he was including me in his new life, was almost more painful than the betrayal itself, because it meant he genuinely didn't understand the depth of what he'd done, or worse, that he did understand and simply didn't care. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, something heavy and final, because I realized that I wasn't just grieving my mother anymore. I was grieving the idea of my father too, the version of him I'd spent my entire life believing in, the one who was supposed to protect us, who was supposed to stand by her, who was supposed to be better than this. And the silence that filled the room after I spoke felt louder than any scream could have been, thick with everything unsaid, everything broken, everything that would never be repaired. Before any of this came to light, before betrayal had a name and a face and a memory attached to it, my family had always looked normal from the outside, the kind of suburban household in a quiet Ohio neighborhood that people pointed to when they talked about stability, with a neatly mowed lawn, holiday decorations that went up on time every year, and parents who showed up to school events and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. And for most of my childhood, I believed we were lucky. that I had what everyone else wanted because my dad worked a steady job in logistics, my mom stayed home when I was younger, and then later picked up part-time work at a local library, and we had routines that felt safe, like Friday pizza nights and Sunday morning grocery runs and family movie marathons when the weather got bad. But even then, there were small things I didn't understand at the time, little moments that only started to make sense when I looked back on them through the lens of everything that happened later. Like the way my father always needed to be the center of attention in every room, how conversations somehow always curved back toward him and his stress and his sacrifices and his frustrations, how my mother learned to soften her own needs so they didn't collide with his, how she'd apologize quickly after disagreements, even when she hadn't done anything wrong, how there was a kind of emotional gravity around him that everyone else had to orbit carefully. And I grew up learning without realizing it that keeping the peace often meant keeping quiet, that discomfort was something you swallowed, that love was something you proved by accommodating someone else's moods. And I didn't have the words for any of that back then. I just knew that sometimes the house felt lighter when he wasn't home and heavier when he was. That my mother's laughter sounded freer when it was just the two of us. That she'd sometimes look tired in ways sleep couldn't fix. And when she got diagnosed with breast cancer when I was in my early 20s, it was like the ground dropped out from under us all at once, because suddenly the routines changed, the appointments took over the calendar, the house filled with pill organizers and paperwork and medical jargon, and I watched my mother shrink, not just physically, but emotionally as the illness progressed, watched her worry more about being a burden than about the pain she was in. And during that time, her friend circle became more present in our lives than ever, which made sense because people showed up with casseroles and offers of rides and words of encouragement. And among them was Melissa, her close friend from book club, the one who'd been around for years, the one who had a warm voice and an easy way of talking that made people feel heard, the one who cried openly when mom first told everyone about the diagnosis and said, "We're gonna fight this together." And for a long time, I believed that was true. I believed that we were surrounded by people who cared because Melissa came over often, sometimes more than anyone else, sitting with mom during long afternoons, watching TV with her, helping her write down questions for the doctors, offering to stay over if dad had to work late. And I remember feeling grateful for her, genuinely grateful, because I thought my mother deserved all the support she could get, because I thought it was beautiful that she had a friend so devoted. And when my father started staying out later during that period, started claiming he was working extra hours to cover medical bills, started taking phone calls in the garage instead of in the house, I didn't question it the way I probably should have, because everything about our lives was already stressful and fragile, and I didn't want to add suspicion to the list of things we were all carrying. And my mother, even in her weakest moments, still spoke kindly about him, still defended him, still said things like, "He's just scared, and this is hard on him too." And I see now how much emotional labor she was doing even while her body was failing her, how much she was trying to hold the family together as it was quietly coming apart behind her back. And when she finally entered hospice, when the doctors stopped talking about treatment and started talking about comfort, there was this heavy, unbearable stillness that settled over everything, like the world had narrowed to the rhythm of her breathing and the slow passage of time. And through all of that, Melissa remained a constant presence, offering sympathy, bringing food, hugging my father when he looked tired, holding my mother's hand and telling her she loved her. And I wish I could see the signs then, that I felt something was off. But the truth is, I trusted both of them. I trusted the narrative that we were surrounded by people who cared. I trusted that even in the middle of tragedy, at least we had loyalty. And that belief, that fragile, naive belief, is what made the eventual truth cut so deeply. Because it meant the betrayal wasn't just something that happened after my mother was gone. It meant it had been unfolding quietly in the background while we were all pretending everything was held together by love and support, when in reality, something rotten had already taken root. After my mother died, the world didn't just feel quieter, it felt distorted, like every familiar thing had been slightly shifted out of place. And grief made time behave strangely, stretching some days into endless hours while others vanished before I'd even processed them. And during those early weeks, my father performed grief in a way that confused me. Because on the surface, he did what was expected. He stood beside me at the funeral with red-rimmed eyes, accepted condolences with a somber nod, thanked people for coming, and told stories about my mother that sounded sincere enough to everyone else. But when the house finally emptied out and the casseroles stopped coming, and it was just the two of us left with the silence, there were moments that felt off in ways I couldn't yet articulate. Moments where his sadness seemed to switch on and off too easily, where he'd sit staring at nothing for 10 minutes and then immediately be absorbed in his phone, typing rapidly, smiling faintly at messages he'd angle away from my view. And I told myself I was imagining things, because grief makes you suspicious. Grief makes you raw. Grief makes everything feel like a threat. And I didn't want to believe anything worse than what we were already living through. But there were other things too, small but persistent, like how Melissa's name came up more often than anyone else's in conversation, how he'd mentioned that she'd checked in on him, that she understood what he was going through, that she'd been there for him in ways no one else really had. And the phrasing struck me, even then, as strange, because we were both there. We were both grieving the same loss, but somehow his emotional world seemed to orbit around her more than around me, his own child. And when I'd try to talk to him about how I was feeling, about how lost and angry and broken I felt, he'd listen for maybe a few minutes before steering the conversation back toward himself, toward how hard this was for him, how lonely the house felt, how he didn't know who he was without my mother. And I started to feel like my grief was inconvenient, like it needed to be packaged neatly so it didn't interfere with his narrative of suffering. And the more I look back, the more I realized how early the emotional manipulation started, how subtly he positioned himself as the primary victim in a tragedy where my mother had been the one who suffered the most, how he leaned into sympathy from others while quietly distancing himself from the person who needed him most. And I think part of why it took me so long to fully accept what was happening is because I'd been conditioned my whole life to give him the benefit of the doubt, to assume his intentions were good, to reinterpret his selfishness as stress, his emotional absence as introversion, his dismissiveness as miscommunication. And that conditioning didn't disappear just because my mother did. It lingered. It shaped how I interpreted everything, which meant that when he started spending more time away from home, when he began taking weekend trips he claimed were just to clear his head, when he started changing his routine in ways that didn't quite add up, I still didn't immediately jump to the worst conclusion, because part of me was still clinging to the idea that he was just a flawed but grieving man, trying to figure out how to survive. And it wasn't until little details began to stack up that I could no longer ignore the pattern, like the time I saw a hotel receipt tucked into a jacket pocket when I was doing laundry, dated from a weekend he'd told me he was staying with an old coworker, or the way Melissa's car started appearing more frequently down the street when I came home from work, parked a little too far away to be casual, or the way he started to grow defensive when I mentioned her, immediately bristling as if I'd accused him of something even when I hadn't. And those moments created a low-grade tension inside me that I lived with every day. A sense that something was wrong but not yet fully formed, not yet undeniable. And the truth is, I think he relied on that ambiguity, on the fact that I didn't want to believe badly enough that I'd ignore the evidence piling up in front of me, because that's how manipulation often works, not through dramatic gestures, but through slow erosion, through convincing someone to doubt their own instincts until they're no longer sure what they're allowed to feel or suspect. And by the time the reality became impossible to avoid, by the time I finally understood that this wasn't a new connection formed out of shared grief, but an existing one that had simply stepped into the open now that my mother was gone, the emotional groundwork had already been laid in a way that made the betrayal feel not just devastating, but destabilizing. Like I no longer trusted my own memory, my own perception of the past, because everything I thought I knew about my family, about loyalty, about the people closest to me, suddenly felt like it had been built on something fundamentally untrue. The confirmation didn't come in one dramatic confession the way people imagine it does. It came in fragments that slowly assembled themselves into something undeniable, like a picture you don't want to see but can't stop looking at. And the moment that finally tipped it from suspicion into certainty happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening when I came home earlier than expected from work, headache pounding, wanting nothing more than to collapse into bed. And instead, I heard laughter before I even opened the front door, not the polite, subdued laughter people use when they're trying to be respectful of grief, but something lighter, more intimate, the kind of laughter that carries familiarity. And when I stepped inside, I saw them in the kitchen, standing too close, Melissa's hand resting casually on his arm while he leaned down to say something quietly in his ear. And they both startled when they saw me, not because they were doing anything overtly inappropriate in that exact second, but because there was a look that crossed both of their faces that I will never forget, a flash of guilt and panic that was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But it was enough. It was more than enough, because you don't look like that unless there's something to hide, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly into something tense and artificial. Melissa overcompensating with cheerfulness, my father suddenly too loud, too insistent that they were just discussing logistics about some donation drive she was helping organize in my mother's name, as if invoking my mother's memory would somehow make everything feel less wrong. And I remember standing there listening to their words while my mind connected dots that I'd been trying not to connect for months. Every late night, every hushed phone call, every unexplained absence lining up into a story I could no longer pretend not to see. And when Melissa finally left that night, after far too much awkward small talk and forced normalcy, I confronted him in a way I'd never confronted him before, not with tears, not with hesitation, but with a steady voice that surprised even me, telling him I didn't believe them, telling him I knew something was going on, telling him if he had any respect left for me at all, he would tell me the truth. And the way he reacted in that moment revealed more than any confession could have, because instead of meeting me with honesty, he went straight to defensiveness, to minimizing, to reframing, telling me I was being unfair, telling me I was projecting my grief onto him, telling me I was looking for someone to blame because I couldn't handle the loss. And it was like watching someone twist reality in real time, like watching the person who had taught me what truth's supposed to look like now actively trying to make me doubt my own perception. And that was the first time I truly understood how deep the betrayal went, because it wasn't just that he was involved with her, it was that he was willing to undermine my emotional reality to protect himself, willing to make me feel unstable, overly sensitive, unreasonable, rather than take responsibility for his actions. And over the weeks that followed, as more details surfaced through careless comments, through overheard conversations, through the way neighbors began to look at me with a mix of pity and curiosity, the scope of it became clearer in ways that felt physically sickening, because it wasn't just that the relationship had begun while my mother was still alive, it was that it had been happening during the worst of her illness, during chemo weeks, during hospital stays, during nights when I sat by her bedside listening to her breathe while he claimed to be working late. And the realization that while I'd been losing my mother piece by piece, he'd been building a new life with someone she trusted, someone she confided in, someone who sat beside her pretending to be a friend, felt like a level of cruelty I hadn't known existed outside of movies. And yet this was real. This was my life. This was my family. And the humiliation of it extended beyond our walls in ways I hadn't anticipated, because once people began to realize how quickly Melissa had stepped into the role of girlfriend, once it became obvious that this wasn't a sudden development, but something that had been brewing for a while, the whispers started, the sympathetic glances, the awkward pauses when conversations shifted, and I could see in people's eyes that they knew, that they were connecting the same dots I had, that they were wondering how long it had been going on, that they were questioning the sincerity of the grief they'd witnessed at the funeral. And I became collateral damage in their scandal, the daughter of the man who cheated on his dying wife with her friend, the silent witness to a betrayal everyone else found shocking, but somehow expected me to endure with grace. And that pressure, that constant awareness of being associated with their choices, began to weigh on me in ways I struggled to explain to anyone else, because it wasn't just grief anymore, it was anger and shame and a deep, gnawing sense of being disrespected, not only as a daughter, but as a human being whose emotional boundaries no longer seemed to matter to the people who supposed to care most. What made everything worse, what pushed it from unbearable to almost surreal, was how quickly my father stopped even pretending to consider my feelings once Melissa's presence in his life became more solid. Because it was like some invisible switch flipped, and suddenly my discomfort was an inconvenience he no longer cared to manage. And within weeks of that confrontation, he started making changes around the house without discussing them with me. Small at first, like moving things my mother had left behind, packing up her bookshelves, donating her clothes, saying he couldn't handle the reminders anymore. But the way he did it felt less like grief and more like erasure, like he was trying to clear space not for healing, but for replacement. And I remember coming home one afternoon to find my mother's framed photo from the hallway gone. The one where she's laughing in the summer sun with her hair tied back. And when I asked him where it was, he shrugged and said, "I put it away. It's too painful to look at." Even though I knew he still kept pictures of her on his phone, still showed them to people when it suited his narrative, still used her memory when it earned him sympathy. And then, without any conversation, without any warning, he started having Melissa over more openly, not just quick visits or brief appearances, but full evenings where she'd cook dinner in our kitchen, sit in my mother's chair at the table, leave her shoes by the door like she belonged there. And I would retreat to my room, listening to the muffled sound of their voices through the walls, the sound of two people building something new on top of the ruins of what they'd destroyed. And it was during that period that the financial realities began to hit too, because my father, who had always been careful with money when my mother was alive, suddenly began spending in ways that didn't make sense. New clothes, new electronics, weekend trips, dinners out. And when I asked him about it, he snapped that it was his money and his life, and that he deserved to be happy after everything he'd been through. As if my mother's illness had been something that had happened to him alone, as if I hadn't lost anything, as if my grief didn't count. And then came the moment that felt like a punch to the chest in slow motion, the moment when he told me, casually, like he was discussing a change in cable providers, that Melissa would be moving in, that it just made sense financially, that they were already spending most nights together anyway, and that I needed to start thinking about my own future because he wasn't going to keep the house frozen in time for my sake. And I remember staring at him in disbelief, trying to understand how we'd arrived here so quickly, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the one who had stood beside me at my mother's funeral. And when I told him I wasn't comfortable with that I couldn't live in the same house as the woman who had betrayed my mother, his response was so cold it still echoes in my head, because he said, "That's something you need to work through, not something I'm going to put my life on hold for." And in that moment, I realized with brutal clarity that he wasn't just choosing her over my mother's memory, he was choosing me, his own daughter. And that realization hollowed something out inside me, because it meant that the betrayal wasn't confined to the past. It was ongoing, it was active, it was being reinforced every day by his decisions, by his refusal to acknowledge the harm he'd caused, by his expectation that I should simply adapt to a reality he'd created through deception. And when Melissa officially moved in, bringing boxes of her things, rearranging furniture, commenting on how the house needed to feel more like a fresh start, it felt less like a new chapter and more like an invasion, like I was being slowly pushed out of the last space that still felt connected to my mother. And the emotional toll of living in that environment, of watching them play house in the background of my grief, of being expected to smile politely through dinners and holidays and awkward family gatherings where people pretended this was normal, began to wear on me in ways that were both subtle and severe, because I started sleeping less, eating less, trusting less. and the anger I'd been trying to manage quietly began to harden into something heavier, something more dangerous to carry around. Because it wasn't just anger at what they'd done, it was anger at the fact that they were continuing to rewrite the narrative, to present themselves as two people who had simply found comfort in each other after a loss, while I was left holding the truth alone, watching the world slowly accept a version of events that felt like a second betrayal layered on top of the first. The confrontation that finally broke everything open didn't happen in a dramatic public scene or a screaming match like people might expect. It happened in the living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the house felt too still and the air felt too thick. When I'd reached a point where carrying the truth alone had become heavier than the risk of speaking it out loud. And it started with something simple, something on the surface that had nothing to do with betrayal at all, because I was going through old paperwork looking for a document I needed, and I came across a folder that didn't belong to me, tucked into a drawer it shouldn't have been in. And inside were printed emails, old ones, dated from nearly a year before my mother died, and I recognized Melissa's name immediately, my stomach tightening before I read the first line, because there's a kind of dread that settles in your body when you know you're about to confirm something you've been trying not to believe. And the emails weren't graphic, they weren't explicit, but they were intimate in a way that felt unmistakable, filled with words like, "I miss you," and "I hate lying to her," and "I wish things were different," and "once this is over, we can finally stop pretending." And the timestamp on one of them, the date burned into my memory now, lined up with a night when my mother had been too weak to get out of bed, when she'd asked me if Dad had called yet, when she'd whispered that she hoped he was okay. And I sat there on the floor with those pages in my hands, feeling like the room had tilted around me, because this wasn't speculation anymore, this wasn't suspicion, this was proof. Tangible proof that while my mother was dying, while she was still hoping, still trusting, still loving him, he had already emotionally checked out and invested himself elsewhere. And when he and Melissa came home later that afternoon, talking softly in the kitchen like everything was normal, like they had built their relationship on the ruins of my family, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't throw the papers, I just held them out and said his name. And when he saw what I was holding, the color drained from his face in a way that felt almost surreal to witness, because for the first time since this all began, he couldn't deflect, he couldn't reframe, he couldn't minimize, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever experienced, because it was filled with everything that had been hidden, everything that had been denied, everything that had been twisted. And when I finally spoke again, my voice felt steadier than I expected it to, because something inside me had shifted from raw emotion to something clearer, sharper. And I told them both, not just him, but her too, because she was standing there pretending to be shocked, pretending this was all some misunderstanding, that I knew, that I had proof, that they didn't get to rewrite history anymore, that they didn't get to pretend this was a relationship born of grief when it was actually born of deception. And the words came out slowly, deliberately, because I wanted them to land, because I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about punishment, this was about truth. And when my father finally tried to speak, tried to say something about complicated emotions and bad timing and how he never meant for things to go this far, I stopped him, not with anger, but with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar, and I said the thing I'd been holding back for months, the thing that felt like both the most painful and most necessary truth of all, which was that what hurt the most wasn't just that he'd cheated, it was that he'd done it while my mother was dying, that he'd allowed her to be comforted by the very person he was betraying her with, that he'd allowed me to grow up believing in a version of him that simply didn't exist, and that he'd continued to choose himself over everyone else every step of the way. And for the first time, there was no argument, no defense, no attempt to shift blame, just the quiet, undeniable weight of being seen clearly for who they were. And that moment, as painful as it was, felt like a breaking point and a beginning at once, because the truth was finally out in the open, not just in my mind, but in the space between us, and there was no way to pretend anymore. After that confrontation, the atmosphere in the house changed in a way that was both tense and strangely clarifying, because the unspoken lies that had been hanging in the air for months were finally acknowledged. And once truth is out in the open, it has a way of stripping away all the excuses people used to hide behind. And for the first time since my mother died, I stopped trying to manage their emotions for them, stopped trying to be reasonable, stopped trying to soften my words so they would be easier to hear, because I realized how much of myself I had been shrinking to keep the peace in a situation where peace was never really an option. And over the days that followed, I began to draw lines that I should have drawn much earlier, starting with the simple but powerful act of refusing to participate in their version of reality, refusing to sit down for family dinners where they played house, refusing to engage in small talk with Melissa as though she hadn't been part of one of the deepest betrayals of my life. And when my father tried to accuse me of being cold, of being unfair, of holding on to anger too tightly, I told him calmly that boundaries were not cruelty, that acknowledging harm was not the same as being vindictive, and that the discomfort he was feeling now was a fraction of what my mother would have felt if she had known the truth. And that conversation marked a shift not just in our dynamic, but in how I saw myself. Because for so long, I had been reacting to their choices, trying to adjust around them, trying to survive emotionally inside a situation I had no control over. But now I began to take my agency back in tangible ways, starting with making plans to move out of the house, not because I was being pushed out, but because I refused to continue living in a space that felt contaminated by dishonesty. And the process of finding my own apartment, signing a lease, and slowly packing up my belongings became more than just logistics. It became symbolic. Every box I filled a small declaration that I was no longer willing to be a passive participant in the aftermath of their betrayal. And when extended family members began to learn the truth, not through gossip, but because I chose to tell them directly when they asked why things felt tense, the response was validating in ways I hadn't expected. Because people didn't excuse what had happened, they didn't sugarcoat it. They acknowledged that it was wrong, that it was deeply hurtful, that my mother deserved better, and that I deserved better too. And that validation mattered, not because I needed others to take sides, but because it countered the internal narrative my father had been trying to impose, the one where I was overreacting, the one where I was the obstacle to everyone moving on. And as I stepped further into independence, both emotionally and practically, I began to see how much of my life had been shaped by accommodating other people's dysfunction, and how freeing it was to finally prioritize my own well-being without guilt. And when I eventually told my father that I needed distance, that I would not be attending holidays where Melissa was present, that I would not be pretending this was a normal family structure, and that our relationship would be limited unless and until he could fully acknowledge the harm he caused without excuses, it wasn't said in anger, it was said with clarity, and the difference mattered because it wasn't about punishing him, it was about protecting myself, about refusing to carry the emotional burden of choices I did not make. And in that space, in that distance, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, steady sense of self-respect returning, piece by piece. Time doesn't erase what happened, but it does soften the sharpest edges of it. And in the years since everything fell apart, I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting or excusing or pretending things didn't hurt as deeply as they did. It's about integrating the truth into your life without letting it define every part of who you are. And for a long time, I was afraid that my story would always begin and end with betrayal, that every relationship I built would be shadowed by distrust, that every memory of family would be tainted by what my father and Melissa did. But that isn't what ultimately happened, because distance created space for perspective, and perspective created space for growth. And as I built a life that existed outside of their choices, new routines, new friendships, new traditions, I began to understand that while I couldn't control the way my family broke apart, I could control the kind of person I became in response to it. And I chose, deliberately, to become someone who values honesty, who names harm instead of hiding it, who sets boundaries instead of absorbing discomfort. And that choice changed everything, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in quiet, meaningful moments, like realizing I could talk about my mother without my chest tightening in pain, like catching myself laughing freely without feeling guilty for experiencing joy, like recognizing that the love my mother gave me, her kindness, her resilience, her integrity, had not been erased by what happened to her, and that I could carry those qualities forward in a way that honored her more than any bitterness ever could. And when I think of my father now, I don't feel the same raw anger I once did, but I don't feel reconciliation either. I feel acceptance of reality, the understanding that some people are not capable of being the version of themselves we need them to be, and that acknowledging that truth is sometimes the healthiest thing you can do. And my relationship with him remains distant, defined by the boundaries I set and maintain without apology, because forgiveness, if it ever comes, would have to be rooted in accountability, and accountability was never something he truly offered. And yet, despite everything, my life is not defined by the worst thing that happened to me. It is defined by the way I chose to respond to it, by the way I refused to let betrayal turn me into someone small or bitter or closed off, by the way I chose instead to build something honest and stable and grounded in truth. And sometimes when I sit alone in the quiet of my own apartment, in a space that feels entirely mine, I think about my mother, about the way she used to squeeze my hand when she was too tired to speak, about the way she told me once that the most important thing in life was to know your worth and never let anyone convince you otherwise. And when I realized in walking away from the lies, in choosing myself, in refusing to participate in a false narrative just to keep others comfortable, I did exactly that. And that realization, more than anything else, feels like peace.